Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harilos Eniziris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. Recently, I asked my chess Facebook friends to select a game of theirs that they would like me to present at my channel. And a few of them gave me two choices, two of their games. And in these cases, I decided to present both of the games they suggested. But in order not to keep the video very long, they're going to be shown in two different videos. Today I'm going to show a game that was selected by my Facebook friend Theodora Κουτσογιαννοπούλου. In fact, she suggested two games, and I'm going to show here the first of the two games that she played against Anna Maria Bότσαρη. By the way, Anna Maria Bότσαρη is another of my chess Facebook friends. So I have two of my Facebook friends playing against each other. That's wonderful. The game took place in Αχαία, year 2016. Αχαία is a province of Greece at the northwest of Peloponnese. It includes the third biggest city of Greece, Patra, but I don't know where exactly in Αχαία did the game took place. I don't know if it took place in Patra or anywhere else. But first, let me share my screen with you. And here we are. What you're going to see is that I'm only sharing a part of the screen, and I'm going to explain why. I was fortunate that chess.com includes this page in their database of the most important games they possess. In fact, in a page called The Favorites of Theodora Kutsogenopoulou. And so I don't need to enter the moves one by one like I did in the previous cases. All I have to do is I'm going to the appropriate link of chess.com, and I'm going to show the games by clicking the forward button. But if I share the entire screen, you're going to see how the game develops, the next moves, and this is going to spoil the suspense. That is why I decided to share with you only the appropriate part of the screen that contains the chessboard. You're going to see the computer evaluation. Stockfish 16 is going to show which of the two sides has advantage. If you see a number at the bottom left, it means that white has the advantage. If you see a number here at the top left, it means that black has the advantage. You're going to see the appropriate numbers. And if there are interesting comments, I'm going to read them for you. Before the game started, as you see here, Theodora is going to have the white pieces and Anna Maria the black pieces. Their ratings. When the game took place in 2016, Theodora had 1940 versus 2346 for Anna Maria. You see a difference of more than 400 points, and Anna Maria is much more famous in Greece, who has won quite a lot of Greek chess championships and has represented the Greek national team. So Anna Maria clearly is a favorite. 9 years later, their ratings have fallen a little bit. Theodora's is 1840 and Anna Maria's is 2221. Still, the difference is more or less the same, 400 points. And with Anna Maria, the heavy favorites, we're going to start. My two Facebook friends facing each other. And Theodora starts with a knight on f3. You see the little booklet here. This book, you're going to see it for the first few moves so long as the players follow theory. This means that these openings have been extensively analyzed in the theory. I'm not sure if there is actually a book that contains them, but they're called book moves for this reason. They're theoretical ones, and usually players at that level, meaning above 2000 or even near 2000, they know them by heart. And they develop entire strategy based on the opening. Knight f3 has the advantage that you, unlike the openings where you start with pawns, you don't tell your opponent which pawns you're planning to push. You keep it as a surprise. And also the knight at f3 controls the d4 and e5 squares, and it's a legitimate opening. Maybe not so popular like d4 and e4, but it's okay. And Anna Maria will reply with a symmetric way, knight to f6. Second move. Theodora places pawn on d4, and controls, of course, the square e5. And Anna Maria pushes her pawn on e6. Just keep in mind that Theodora had very little choice about which pawn to push, because if she had pushed the pawn to e4, it would have been grabbed by the knight on f6. Next move, Theodora places her pawn on e3. As I mentioned before, cannot push it to e4, otherwise pawn is lost by the knight. Move number 3. Anna Maria is going to push the b pawn to b6, and you may be wondering why not a central pawn and a pawn in the wings, because she's planning to place a bishop on b7, bishop fianchettos, and controls the long diagonal from h1 to a8. Bishops love to control these two long diagonals, h1 to a8 and a1 to h8. Continue now. Theodora develops her light color bishop, sends it to d3, and she is now ready to castle. Anna Maria will place her bishop on b7, as we had mentioned. Bishop is fianchettoed and controls the long diagonal. To make things even better for her, there are no pawns on e4 and d5, so the bishop from b7 can go all the way until f3. Move number 5. Short side castling or kingside castling for Theodora, and bishop to e7 for Anna Maria. 5 moves for each player. All of them are book moves. And as you see here from the number 0.3, Theodora has a very small advantage. And this is because white starts first. It's not a real advantage. Things can very easily change later. Or they may stay the same and have a draw in the end. Who knows? Let's see. Theodora will push her pawn to c4. By doing so, she has more control of the square d5, the central square, and also the knight can later go to c3 without blocking the pawn at c2. Anna Maria plays symmetrically pawn to c5 and exerts pressure on d4. Theodora places knight on c3. Now the knight does not block the pawn, and it's free to go to c4, control to d5, and participate in the battle for the center. And Anna Maria will grab the pawn on d4. Theodora takes back. Anna Maria will push the pawn from d7 to d6. We are move number 8. We are following theory, but you'll see something a little bit surprising here. Usually if players follow theory, they're supposed to be more or less even. A small advantage of 0.3 may be okay, but here you see that Theodora has advantage of 1.1, more than a pawn. And this means that either Stockfish 16 has a problem in evaluating the position, or the theory has a problem. And me, with a rating of 1600, I'm in no position to tell you which is which. But let's see how game continues with move number 9. Theodora will push her pawn to d5, and Anna Maria will block her pawn, push her pawn to e5. 9 moves have been completed for both players, and until now it's completely theory, but somehow Theodora has an advantage of 1.1. But let me tell you, many times in the past there have been openings that supposedly were good for theory, but computers found that they have issues, especially with very high rated players. And theory had to change. Let's see. Will this change this opening? And now move number 10. We deviate from theory. Theodora will place her knight on g5. Computer says it is good. You see the check mark, not the best. She keeps an advantage of 1.0 instead of 1.1. Computer would rather have the knight go to h4. With this green arrow, you'll see which move the computer thinks would be the best in case the player does not play it. And this check mark means the move is good. If you see thumbs up, it is excellent. And if you see a star, it's the best. 1 exclamation mark means it's great, and 2 exclamation marks mean it's brilliant. How will Anna Maria reply? She doesn't like this knight on g5. and she will try to throw it back with pawn to h6. Computer says it is inaccuracy. The best option was to develop a knight and attack the center. Computer would rather have the knight go to d7, and with this inaccuracy, you see the orange circle with question mark followed by exclamation mark. This means inaccuracy. Inaccuracy means a small error. And Theodora's advantage jumps to 1.4, as you see here. We completed the first 10 moves, and Theodora has advantage of 1.4, or if you want the second decimal here, it is 1.47. It's quite significant so early, but no guarantee it will stay, especially when you face an experienced opponent like Anna Maria Bocciari. Move number 11. Of course, Theodora is going to save her knight, but where? f3, e4, h3, or maybe even take a chance by taking the pawn on f7. She will take it to e4, the best move. You see the star, you see the green arrow agrees with the move. And now Maria will grab the knight, once again the best move. Theodora will take it back with her bishop. Inaccuracy is the computer. Would rather have the knight take it, so her advantage drops a little bit to 1.0. And now Anna Maria develops the knight to d7. Computer doesn't like it. Would rather have the bishop go back to c8. Why? Because with the pawns on c4, d5, and the bishop on e4, the bishop at b7 is blocked. Yes, it's in the long diagonal, but cannot do too much. Perhaps the computer would rather have the bishop go to c8 and then change the diagonal, and only then move the knight, so it doesn't block the bishop if he decides to change. Move number 13 now. Queen goes to g4 for Anna Maria, the best move. It attacks the pawn on g7. Of course, there are many ways to defend it, but as I have mentioned in other videos, when two good players, when two great players, in fact, face each other and they threaten, usually they don't expect the opponent to miss it and fall for the threat. But what they want to do is have the opponent waste the move defending against the threat instead of having their own plans. Unless, of course, the opponent can reply with an even bigger threat. This can happen occasionally, and it is great chess when it happens. Now, how can Anna Maria reply? It is very tempting, especially for lower rated players, to castle short side because you castle like you're supposed to do, and the king defends the pawn on g7. But in this case, Theodora is going to grab the pawn on h6 because of the pin. The pawn on g7 cannot take it back. And even worse, threatens with mate on g7. Yes, there are ways to defend against this mate, but Anna Maria will be a pawn down, and in addition will have wasted moves defending against a threat. That is why Anna Maria will defend a different way. Bishop goes to f6. Clearly now, if Theodora decides to grab the pawn on h6, there is no pin, and she loses the bishop. And Theodora decides to develop her bishop, but not on h6, where it's lost, not on g5, where it's lost, not on f4, where it's lost, and only e3 and d2 remains. She selects the square d2. The computer would rather have the bishop from e4 go down to c2. Perhaps then queen goes to c4, and in case of castling, Theodora can checkmate in one move, which means this is not going to happen, but will stop Anna Maria from castling kingside. And Anna Maria will push the pawn to h5. You see the checkmate, good move. The queen is ticked by a pawn and must now move or be captured. You don't like the queen on g4, but the computer would rather have the bishop go to c8, the light colored bishop, and you see the arrow here, and change the diagonal. And Theodora, of course, is going to move her queen to e2, the best move. You see the star and the green arrow agreeing with the move. And Anna Maria decides it's not safe to castle. That's why king is going to go to f8. Computer would rather have the queen to e7 and keep the castling option open for later move. Gives a check mark, a good move for black. That's not a mistake, but it's not the best move either, says the comment of the computer. We completed 15 moves, and you see that Theodora's advantage has jumped to 1.9. But will Anna Maria be able to come back? Because 480 points is quite significant. To give an analogy of today, Magnus Carlsen with a rating of 2800 faced a 2400 rated player. Even if Magnus Carlsen was down by 1.9, you could safely bet your money on him. Now, Theodora will continue by pushing the pawn to b4. Control more space, exert press on c5, but computer once again would like the bishop from e4 go down to c2. Backwards moves are not easy to see because most of the times they are not the best moves, and that's why many coaches would advise their lower rated players, unless there is a very serious reason otherwise, please, please, please don't send your pieces back. It is the exception. But when it is a good move and this exception is really the winning one, it is a great. How will Anna Maria continue? Pawn goes to g6. Good move. This creates a pawn chain, linked pawns that form a strong structure, says the computer, meaning pawns from a7 to g6 to h5. The problem is that this pawn chain is too near the king. I'm not sure how good it is. Creates weaknesses in the dark colored square. So if the bishop on f6, for example, could be exchanged, and especially both bishop and the queen on d8, white could use the knight or perhaps the light colored bishop and rooks to attack through the dark colored squares. Theodora is going to place, of course, on the other side, you have to see that if the pawns are in f7 and h5, what can black do? Put a pawn on g6 could be, as I say, the least of the evils. Theodora will continue now. Move number 17. Rook goes to c1. Usually it's a good idea if you have a rook on the A file to send it to C, especially when the C file is semi-open, meaning there's only a white pawn in front, no black pawn. Ideally, rooks want open files if they exist. If they don't exist, the next best choice are the semi-open ones. And here there are no open files yet. And since Anna Maria cannot castle, she will try to do something like castling by hand, meaning moving the king to g7, the best move according to the computer, while g7, not g8, that would really be the castling position, in order to give more space to the rook at h8. Continue now, next move. Bishop goes to b1 for white. Computer would rather have it on c2, but I think the idea is the same. Put the queen on d3 or e4 and control this diagonal. And the computer comment says that's fine. And Anna Maria will place her bishop on e7, the best move, very precise. The computer doesn't explain why. One of the problems that some YouTube streamers have highlighted is a computer comments many times, they don't explain enough. Anna Maria will start pushing, excuse me, Theodora starts pushing the pawns, pushes the pawn to f4. Why? It's not easy for black to take advantage of the open diagonal from b6 to g1. Bishop is blocked by the pawn on d6, queen is blocked by the pawn on b6, so black cannot easily even issue a check, let alone have a dangerous attack, while Theodora is hoping to open the f file where her rook is placed. Anna Maria will try to counteract in the queen side, but sending the pawn to a5 is a mistake. The comment doesn't explain too much. They say white was better off, but now their position is winning. You see the advantage 2.6. The most likely it's an error because the pawn the pawn on b6 is weakened. It's only protected by the queen on d8 and not by the other pawn on a7. You have to be very careful when you push pawns. Theodora will place her pawn on a3. That's not the right idea. So the computer say Stockfish and doesn't say which would be the right idea. It only shows the right. It shows it here. Yes, go to f5 and. But the reason of Theodora's move is that if the pawn on a5 takes on b4, then Theodora does not lose a pawn and doesn't need to move her knight on c3. Instead, the pawn on a3 will take it back. There is a reason behind it. And move number 20. Pawn on a5 takes b4, the best move on the computer. And after the 20 moves, let's see what is the case. Theodora is leading by 1.7. She even had a bigger lead before. And let's see if she'll be able to continue with this advantage and convert it to victory, or if Anna Maria will come back and either equalize or even win the game. Anything can happen. We completed the first 20 moves. Theodora, of course, naturally will take back the pawn on b4. And now Anna Maria is trying to block the f file, push the pawn to f5. The best move is the computer, because the rook on f1 was controlling too much space, especially if the pawn on f4 would vanish. Which is why Theodora decides to change the file of attack. The rook goes to e1. Not the best for the computer. In fact, a question mark, a mistake. Would rather have the knight go to b5. I have an outpost. Outpost means a square that is occupied by the knight. Ideally, it is protected by a pawn behind, like the c4, and there are no pawns to attack it, because the a pawn and the c pawn are not there any longer. That's why b5 would be an outpost, an ideal square for the knight. And I need to say to everybody, I'm reading what the computer is saying. In the game, I would never have been able to come up with these thoughts and plans. Hopefully I'm learning, but I'm not here to criticize the players. They are doing much better, both of them, than I could ever have done myself. Bishop to f6 for black. And me, says the computer, would rather have the bishop go to a6. Why? To stop the knight from taking the outpost on b5. And one move, with one move delay, based on the computer's ideal, Theodora is going to do it. Knight goes to b5. And the computer says, you see the exclamation mark. It is a great move. This is the only good move. The knight now occupies a secure outpost. Not only that, it also attacks the pawn on d6. And if it goes there, it attacks the bishop on b7. But Anna Maria, her turn is to play, and of course is going to protect the pawn by moving the queen to b8. Computer gives a check mark. It protects the pawn. Would rather have the queen go to e7, but believe me, it's not a good day when you need an entire queen to protect the pawn. You want the queen to do more important things than just protect the poor pawn. And Theodora will control the long diagonal with her bishop. Excellent move, says the computer. The best would have been the pawn on f4 to take on e5, but almost equal to the best is the excellent move. Bishop to c3, and so both sides have their diagonal bishops on the long diagonal from a1 to h8. Rook to e8 for Anna Maria. There is an idea behind that, that if the pawn on e5 disappears, then take for example the pawn on f4, then the rook attacks the queen. But it's not very effective, because let's assume this happens. Queen e2 takes rook on e8, rook on e1 takes, rook will go from a8 to e8, and there is no difference in material. And now, let's see how Theodora is going to continue. And Theodora continues with a brilliant move. You see the two exclamation marks. Two exclamation marks means it's brilliant. What does brilliant mean? It means that not only is the best, but you're taking a chance because you are sacrificing material. Black can easily use the g6 pawn to take the bishop on f5. So white is gambling that the positional extra they're going to get is much more than the material they're going to lose. And if this turns out to be the case, and the computer believes it will be the case, that's why they give the exclamation marks. Otherwise, you would see two question marks, a blunder, if it was just a plain loss of a piece. That's what the computer thinks, but let's see if the game will vindicate Theodora and Stockfish, the computer. And Anna Maria has no other choice other than to use the pawn to get the bishop. Why? Because Theodora has already grabbed the pawn. He's attacking the knight on d7, and of course, if black is not going to get the bishop, they would defend the knight, they wouldn't lose the knight, but still there would be a pawn down for nothing. At this point, we completed the first 25 moves, and the computer shows Theodora's advantage jumping all the way to 2.5. It's quite significant. But as we all know, all you need is one blunder and the game can change dramatically. I'm going to discuss now the difference between chess and tennis, so you can think of any other sport. In tennis, if you win 6-0, 5-0, and you have a double fault, the worst error you can do in tennis is have a double fault, meaning you serve twice and the ball doesn't go where it's supposed to go. Well, the 40-0 will become 40-15, but still the player ahead most likely is going to win. In chess, you make the opposite error. You can be ahead by 5 or even more, and you make a blunder in the end, and everything is lost. You may remember the previous game when Mr. Kostatsianis, he was leading by an enormous advantage, but had he blundered at the last move and used his rook to take the pawn on a2, then he would have lost immediately the game. That is the difference between tennis and chess. But let's see how the game is going, because it's not enough to have an advantage of 2.5, and of course during the game none of the players knew it, but you have to have the correct follow-up. You don't need a blunder to be behind. All you need to do is not be very accurate. First of all, Theodora is going to win the second pawn on h5, so we have at least 2 pawns for the piece. According to the mathematics of the pieces, a pawn is worth 3 pawns, excuse me, a piece is worth 3 pawns, the bishop is sacrificed, so she got back 2 out of the 3. And Anna Maria will place her rook on h8. The reason for doing so is to have the queen leave the h file. And clearly Theodora must move her queen, and she cannot even put it on the g file. g6, g5, and g4 are all controlled by black. She has to put it as 3, 2, or d1, but the computer thinks that this is an inaccuracy. And you're going to see, this leaves a pawn without defenders. Yes, and it's a pawn on f5. And the advantage of Theodora becomes 4.4. It becomes so strong that perhaps not even Magnus Carlsen could come back from such a position. But let's see how game continues. Yes, I didn't see it before. Theodora will grab the pawn on f5, and she already got back the 3 pawns that she sacrificed for the attack. Materially, we're the same, but and also she attacks the knight on d7, but will she be able to win? You see, now Anna Maria needs to defend the knight on d7. There are many moves to do it. Either move the knight itself or move the queen or the rook near the knight. Or what she decides to do is place the bishop on c8. This has a star the best. It blocks the queen on b8, that's true. It minimizes its mobility. But Anna Maria, all she needs to do is remove the knight from d7 and threatens the white queen that doesn't have too many squares to go. can go to neither G or H files. Has to go back e4, d3, c2, b1. But Theodora decides to continue the attack with the rook. Brook another piece in the attack. Rook goes to e3. It's an excellent move. You see the thumbs up. Computer would rather have the queen go to g4, but when you have excellent move, it means that although it is not the very best, at least a very, very good one, and keeps almost all of your advantage. Knight to f4, to f8 for Anna Maria. The best move is a computer, clearly, and attacks the white queen. And the white queen must go back. Unless, of course, Theodora decides to first check with the rook. Yeah, that's what she does, because by checking the rook, black Anna Maria cannot take the white queen, must reply first to the check. How will she reply? How many legal moves do you have? When you're faced with a check, think of how many legal moves you have. You can cover it with a knight on f8, but don't do it because queen will grab the knight. With the bishop goes to g5, once again you lose material. The king can go to h8, to h6, not h8, h8 is a rook. But then the rook on h3 can check again, and I'm not sure if this is a good check or not, because you have a queen and a rook at the same diagonal of the bishop. And the king can go to f7. And that's what black decides to do. And now Anna Maria needs to, Theodora needs to think, what will she do with a queen? She decides, believe it or not, to take the bishop, even though the bishop is protected by the queen. And that is why the computer gives 2 exclamation marks, is brilliant, and the comment says the queen was sacrificed, a stunning move. And you're going to see why this was such a brilliant move. Theodora was not in a generous move, trying to offer pieces to her opponent. Players, especially top players, are never in a generous move when they play chess. Theodora knows that she's going to lose a queen. We completed now the first 30 moves, and let's see how things are going. And although Theodora is a queen down, materially she's down by +6, as you see here. But Theodora's advantage is 4.2, it's an enormous. From this level, from this advantage, you really need either a major blunder or repeated mistakes, or even too many inaccuracies to come back. And unfortunately, this happen even with great players. Yesterday at the World Cup of Chess in Goa, India, one of the greatest American players, Wesley Shaw, he had a draw position and he resigned. So even if something with Wesley Shaw with the rating way above 2,500, you can have such a blunder, Theodora better focus and concentrate all the way until the end if she really wants to end up the winner and not regret that she had such an enormous advantage and blew the game. Let's see what's going to happen. Move number 31, and you see now the idea behind the queen sacrifice. Knight goes to d6, a great move. And this is the only move that works is a computer, and of course I agree. This defends a pawn that was under attack, meaning the pawn on c4, and had no defenders but does something else. You see the fork? The knight threatens both king and queen. And let's see how black will reply the fork. They cannot move the queen because of the check. They have to move the king. King goes to e7, and of course the black queen has to say goodbye and leave the game. Knight takes the queen, and rook takes a knight. And now finally Theodora is up by +1 in material. You're going to see it here at the bottom. What does it mean is she has sacrificed a piece for 4 pawns. you're going to see that yes, she has a piece less because both sides have two rooks, but and one bishop, but Anna Maria has a knight, Theodora does not, but count the pawns. 6 for Theodora, 2 for Anna Maria. Let's continue. Pawn to e5 for Theodora. Pawn is near the black king, and also the rook, not the rook from g3 has the same visibility it had before, but the bishop on c3 becomes stronger. And Anna Maria cannot take back the pawn because then she's going to lose her bishop. Not only that, the rook on h8 is threatened. So Anna Maria decides to move her bishop to h4, the best move, and threaten the rook on g3. Of course, Theodora is not going to fall asleep and leave the rook to be captured, but she has to waste a move defending the rook instead of doing something else. But what if there's something else you're planning is exactly the something else that will save your rook? Because now Theodora has a great move. In fact, this move was not possible before with the bishop on f6. Theodora will move the rook to g7 and check. Excellent move, says the computer. Would prefer the rook to go to g4, but it's an excellent one. Look at the check. The king, the black king, can, of course, he cannot stay on the 7th rank because of the check, cannot go to the 6th rank because of the pawns on d5, e5, and has only two choices, d8, e8. You don't want your king to be back in the end, especially with the rook on the 7th rank, because a king cannot escape the 8th rank, and all you need is a few more pieces and checkmate the king. King goes to e8 for Anna Maria. Why 8 and not d8? Because since Theodora has a dark-colored bishop on c3, ideally you want your king not to be on a dark-colored square because then the bishop cannot check it. Not always the case, but if everything else is equal, that's one way to decide where to place your king. Bishop goes to d4 for Theodora. Is ready to take the pawn on b6 and the, control the d8 square. Anna Maria will place her rook on h5, the best move, and the computer says this piece finds a new active square. We completed the first 35 moves, and materially, Theodora is up by 2 points, as we see here. And she has a much better position. 4.0 on the computer, but the difference is so big that you don't even need the computer to see it. Her rook is on the 7th rank. The ideal place for a rook is on the 7th if you're white, or the 2nd if you're black, especially if the king is on the 8th rank, a black king, or the 1st rank for white. Because in addition to everything else, you are blocking the king, cannot go anywhere. And and we know that in the end of the game, the king ideally should become very active and if possible, centralize it. This is what the theory says you should do, but what if your opponent, having such a rook, does not allow you to do so? You know the theory very well, but what good is it to know the theory if you cannot act on it? Let's continue now. Next move, 36. Pawn goes to c5 for white. Good move, not the best. This creates a pawn chain, linked pawns that form a strong structure. Yes. What would the computer want? Pawn goes to g3 because it attacks the bishop on h4, and h4, where can it go? No matter where it can go, it's not a good place. It can go to g5, attacked by the rook. Yes, defended by the black rook, but then pawn goes to g4, black rook needs to move, and black loses the bishop. Can go to f6, forget it. The pawn on e5 can go to e7. Not so bad because it might help the king escape from the 8th rank, but you have it's too near the king. Maybe, or then no, d8. D8 is even worse, blocks the king. That is why the c5 is a good move, has a check mark, but not the best. How does Anna Maria reply? She grabs the pawn. Good move, not the best. Fedora continues with the pawn, grabbing the pawn on c5, and look at this position. Anna Maria has no pawns. Theodora has 5 pawns, and of course, all of them are passed pawns. In fact, 3 of them are connected to each other, and they are above the middle of the 5th rank. 2 of them in the beginning, in the first 2 ranks. If the bishops and the knights and the rooks did not appear, these 2 pawns, g2 and h2, without anything else, would be enough for the win. But now the position is a little bit different. Of course, Theodora's advantage is even larger. You see the 3.9. But with more pieces being there, it's not that impossible to blunder a piece and game can change automatically. That is why, if I was white, I would try to exchange whatever I could. Move 37 for black. Anna Maria sends a bishop to g5. The problem with that move, and let me see, no, it attacks the white rook on c1. It's not so simple like saying white will push the pawn g4, rook goes away, and then g7, rook takes g5, because in the meantime, the bishop from g5 will attack the rook on c1. Excellent move. This wins time by threatening a rook and forcing it to move away. So next move, white will send the rook to f1, the best move. Open file, you want your rooks on open files. Both white rooks are on open files, f and g. The black rook c8 is semi-open. In fact, by now there are no closed files because there are no black pawns. But black doesn't have too much of a choice. Needs the rook to control, if possible, the white pawns. If the black rook went, for example, to a8 or b8, the white pawns would be even more free to advance. And of course, the black bishop needs to move, otherwise pawn goes to g4, black rook has to leave, and then white rook takes the bishop. Let's see what will black do. Bishop to h6, not only bishop leaves the g file, but also attacks the white rook on g7, which means that white, once again, needs to stop any other plan and save the rook. And where would white send the rook? To g8? The best move is a computer. It pins the knight at f8. Of course, the problem with that move is that the white king can escape on the 7th rank. Is not constrained on the 8th rank anymore. What will black do? Anna Maria, what will she do? She will send the rook to h4 and attack the white bishop on d4. And since Theodora loves to have her bishop on a central square d4 because it controls or exerts pressure on the maximum of 13 different squares on 2 diagonals. That is why instead of moving the bishop, she will protect it with a pawn on g4, the best move. The pawn is protected by the rook on g8, so the white rook on h4 cannot take the pawn. Instead, Anna Maria will attack the other pawn on d5, sending rook on d8. Computer thinks it's excellent, would rather have the rook go to b8 to have open file, but if black does so, then the pawns c, d5, d5, and e5 can advance much, much easier. We completed the first 14 moves, 4.9 advantage for Theodora. Under best play, the game is over, but as I mentioned before, it doesn't take too much to blunder. Of course, Theodora, in addition to everything else, she doesn't have to worry about a background issue because there are no pawns. In fact, there is the h2 pawn, but no f2 and g pawns in front of the king. So what are Anna Maria's hopes? There is no background hope. She still has a knight. It's pinned for now, but knights can be very, very tricky. They can create forks when you least expect it. if you see them in advance, you can take advantage, like uh, Theodora did, and won a pawn by sacrificing a bishop and later having this wonderful royal fork. But sometimes it can happen when you least expect them, so Theodora better be careful before every one of her moves. If I was her, this is what I would ask. Can the knight go anywhere and create fork? Not necessarily with a check. You can have a fork by, for example, attacking the two rooks, not necessarily a check. For now, the knight is pinned, but and of course the king cannot go to f7 and threaten the rook on g8 because of the other rook. But Theodora especially has enough time, and unfortunately we don't know how much time the players had. So in every move she should think, can the knight on f8 create a pin? Also, even the bishop can create a pin if the two white rooks are on light colored, on dark colored squares, then the bishop could easily be on a square that attacks both. The rooks can also create double attacks, but usually the rooks, because they go in a straight line, it's easier to notice them. For example, you cannot even see an example because white has one bishop and perhaps have a bishop and a pawn on the same line and lose the pawn. Still, even if white accidentally loses a pawn, they're still winning. The rooks not much they can do unless the two rooks can go together. For example, if you have two rooks on the h file, they can take the h2 pawn and but rook's not so easy. But clearly, although Theodora is almost winning, she better watch over her shoulder every single move, make sure no nasty surprises. And I'm saying this because both I won and lost games myself with nasty surprises. And we completed the first 40 moves with an enormous advantage of 4.9 for Theodora. But let's see how the game will continue. The plan for Theodora is avoid any nasty surprises and push the pawns to promotion. Not easy currently, even though the c5 pawn has nothing in front of it. Because the king, you don't like it on the 8th rank, but at least on the 8th rank, it might be able to stop the pawns. Pawn to d6. For Theodora, computer would rather have the pawn go to on c5 go to c6 because this pawn has nobody in front of it, and even sacrifice the d5 pawn because then the pawn goes to c7. But Theodora perhaps wisely decides no time to sacrifice material. We'll only sacrifice it if we see a tactic that leads to a completely sure win, not unnecessarily. And still, although this is not the best, computer says an excellent. What the computer says, no, black can't stop white from winning material if they make the right move. And there is an if statement, if they make the right move. The black king goes to d7. Threatens to win material through a tactic. White will check from d7, excuse me, from f7, and the king, where did he go? If it went to e8, in fact, even before this could happen, white could very well sacrifice the, what they do, that would be too risky, to sacrifice the two rooks for bishop, knight, and bishop. But then why would have a bishop for two rooks? No, it wouldn't be too safe to do it. But now look at it. If king goes to e8, rook goes to e7 for white, it's checkmate. So the king has to go either to c8 or to c6. Only two choices. It has to go to c6. Bishop to f2 for white. Doesn't want to be too near the king because king will go to d5 and threaten the bishop. Goes to f2 and threatens the rook on h4. And rook has only one safe square to go, it's h3. Computer would rather have the knight go to e6. I can't understand. Because yes, then the black rook would threaten on d8 would threaten the white on g8. White could exchange them and put the knight back, and then black. What do you mean? If the knight went to e6, rook from g8 takes on d8, knight takes back, and the white wins the black rook. Like, I'm not sure why that would be better. King goes to g2 for whites, and now at least the black rook can escape. Goes to c3. Computer would rather have it go to a3. I'm not sure why that would be better. At least now the rook is threatening the pawn on c5. Pawn to g5 for whites. And the bishop on h6 is lost. There's nowhere to go. And just to tell you, I said that the rook on c3 was attacking the pawn on c5, but with the bishop on f2, that is not possible. Black would need to sacrifice a rook for a bishop and a pawn. But now black has even worse problems than that. What to do with the bishop on h6 that is lost? So black decides to push the knight on e6, exchange the rooks, and then bishop could go to g5. I'm not so sure because it's white's turn after the exchanges. At this point, we completed the first 45 moves. White has an enormous advantage of 4.8. The near victory, it doesn't seem that black has too many nasty surprises, especially if pieces are exchanged. That's why when you're ahead, you want to exchange pieces. The fewer the pieces remain, the fewer the chances for your opponent to make a nasty tactic and be ahead. Of course, the opponent can also fall trick on a nasty tactic, but your opponent, if they're behind, they're losing either way or other. That is why if you're ahead, exchange pieces most of the times. There are always exceptions. If you're behind, try to avoid exchanges, especially if possible. Try to keep queens. There are no queens here, but if there were, try to keep them. A queen might give a perpetual check when you least expect it, and you may be able to get a draw out of nowhere. Not the case here. What are we going to do here? And of course, Theodora is going to grab the rook. And now, instead of grabbing back the rook, Anna Maria saves her bishop, goes to g5. And the rook on d8 is threatened twice, both by the knight on e6 and the bishop on g5. But don't worry, because white plays, and of course he saw the threats, and moves the rook to c8 with a check. Computer would rather have it go to e8, but it doesn't make any difference. Yes, and threaten the knight. Now we threaten the king, and the king can go where? Also, the rook gives adds extra protection to c5. The king has three squares, b6, b5, d5, and I doubt it matters. King goes to the best square, d5. It's a little bit hidden, not easy to make checks, but this also clears the way for the promotion. Pawn goes to d7 for Theodora. Rook to c2 for Anna Maria. What can she hope for? Maybe the bishop go to h4 or f2, and then use to check. Even that, the rook on f7 is going to save the day. And Theodora plays the most natural move. So natural. She promotes the pawn to d8 with a check. The best move. I'm saying it's not so natural because the pawn can be grabbed by the knight or the bishop. Anna Maria decides to use a bishop. And now Theodora uses her rook to take the bishop. And Theodora has an advantage of 4.5. And at this point, Anna Maria resigned. Why did she resign? Not too many things to do. There are 3 pawns, an extra rook, and 3 pawns that can promote. The best move would be perhaps to take the pawn on e5. We're going to see the follow-up. What does the computer think would be the best follow-up? I missed it, yes. The knight could take the rook, and now look at the position. After 52 moves, white has rook, bishop, and 2 pawns. Black has only the rook. Pawns are protected, and especially the h pawn can easily advance and go all the way to promotion. If the black rook decides to stop it, then the c pawn will promote. If the king decides to go near, white better move the rook to g8 so that the king cannot go to the g or the h files. And this concludes the game. And let's see, what does the computer think about the review? We're going to do the review, but here what we're going to do is we're going to share the entire screen because we want to see the various categories. How did the game go? We need a little bit of time until I'm able to show what happened. And I'm going to share the screen. We're going to see the summary of the computer. Here we are. You can see on the right part, the computer says, you see that after a point, the game was more or less even, and then Theodora's advantage became larger and larger. Theodora had an accuracy of 91.5 against 87.6 for Anna Maria, and Theodora played as if her rating was 2600. That is enormous. That puts you at the top 100 players of the whole world, clearly. If you can match such a rating, clearly Grandmaster level. The problem, of course, is that you need to be consistent on that level. One game you may play like a grandmaster, but that does not necessarily make you grandmaster. But really, Theodora, wonderful game. Congratulations. And even Anna Maria with 2300 is way above anything I could do, above most of the players. And let's see the various categories. Two brilliant moves for Theodora. As I have mentioned yesterday, yesterday we had Mr. Kostas Tsiamis with 3 brilliant moves. But even 2 is wonderful. I had very, very, very rarely had 2 brilliant moves in the same game myself. And 2 great moves, meaning total of 6 exclamation points for Theodora Κουτσογιαννοπούλου. Best moves 21 versus 22. This means that out of 50 moves of the games, Theodora had the best moves in 2 plus 2, 4 plus 21, 25 plus 9 books, 34, meaning 2/3 out of the moves of Theodora are the best moves according to Stockfish 16. And even the others are not too much behind. And let's compare, even Anna Maria did very well, 22 best plus 9 books, 31 out of 49. This is clearly more than half. It's about 60%. Also, that's a great performance for Anna Maria. What else do we see? We said the best 21 versus 22 of 21 Theodora, 22 Anna Maria. Excellent 7 for Theodora, 5 for Anna Maria. Good 5 for Theodora, 6 for Anna Maria. books, 9 moves each of them. Well, we didn't reach the 14-13 we had in the previous game, but still to be able to play the first 9 moves from theory is, I would say, very impressive. And let's go to the negatives. 3 inaccuracies for each one of them. Mistakes, 1 for Theodora, 2 for Anna Maria, 1 miss for Anna Maria, and 0 blunders. This concludes the first of the 2 games that Theodora suggested I present to you. Theodora, thank you very much for making this game available to me. Thanks to everybody watching this game, to all of the viewers. And of course, thanks to the people that click the like button, to the subscribers. And if you want to become a subscriber, all you need to do is click this wonderful subscribe button. And some of you have left some nice comments. Thank you very much. We're going to continue. We're going to continue the second game that Theodora suggested. That's all for now. I'm Harry Lassaneziris. This is my grecochess YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Goodbye.